Hello there, friends. As many of you know, my next book is called Religious Freedom in a Secular Age, where I'm looking at the topic of religion, secularism, law, and how to resolve conflicts between the two. Along the way, I encountered some of the research of a particular scholar, Jacques Berlinerblau, and his book, Secularism, The Basics. Professor Jacques, he's got two doctorates, one in ancient Near Eastern language, another one in sociology. He teaches at Georgetown University, and he's been talking about secularism for, over 20 years, what it is, what it means for the academy, for wider society. And this book is a great book that gives a taxonomy of different types of secularisms, explains what it is and what it isn't. And I thought it would be great to sit down and have a chat with Professor Jacques and to talk about the things we like and don't like about secularism. So yeah, we're going to have a good chat with that. That's the interview that's to come. That's what you're going to hear from next. I hope you enjoy, and by all means, if you have any questions or any comments you want to add, please put them in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe, share, and let other people know about this great interview about secularism. I guarantee you will learn something about religion and about secularism from watching this interview. And here I am talking with Professor Jacques Berlinerblau about his book, Secularism, The Basics. Now, I'm very much interested in this topic because I think secularism is something that is always in the news. Christians and people of all faith can be a little bit worried about secularism. But this is a book that explains what it is, what it isn't, how diverse it is, and why it's something that people of faith really do need to take an interest in. Because, we often talk about people having religious illiteracy, but there's also a secular illiteracy. But let's begin off with talking to the good professor himself. So who is Jacques Berlinerblau?
What a great question. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me. Jacques Berlinerblau contains academic multitudes. He writes on a lot of subjects, but I've been at secularism now for about 20 years. Another issue I work on, I feel they're all related, is literature, and I work on comedy. So those three, to my mind, go together, but secularism is the touchstone. It's in between those two other pieces of the arc. The arch of the arch. Yes,
that's terrific. I mean, religion and comedy. I mean, man, you're talking to the guy. I am the Austin Powers of biblical studies. If you don't believe me, let me put my glasses on.
Yeah, baby. Yeah, that's good.
It's funny because it's kind of true. But anyway, I'm glad you're into comedy as well.
I was thinking about that the other day. I teach this comedy writing class. That's an inspired performance in Austin Powers. That is like that character stays with you for years, right? He pops up in your thoughts in the strangest places. Great comedy.
And he completely destroyed the James Bond franchise for about 10 years. No one could take it seriously anymore.
Gifted comedian.
Indeed. But yes, comedy. I love. Maybe one day we'll talk about comedy and religion. That'd be. We could do a lot of good things there.
You know what Nietzsche once said, if I may. Nietzsche apparently once said, I can't remember where he said it, where there is laughter, there is not religion. So I guess we'd have to work that one in. First, I've got to find the site.
Yep.
But I do think that is interesting that Nietzsche said that, of all people. But anyway.
Hey, look, people say a lot of crazy things when they're dying of syphilis. So, it's funny because it's also true, isn't it, Jacques?
Oh my God, you got the A game today. I better level up. All right.
This is what I do for a living. I have to talk to uppity undergrads who think they know better than me. But anyway, the book Secularism, The Basics, what made you write this book?
Yeah, so I've been at this for like 20 years now. This is a good anecdote. I received an email from Routledge University Press, or Routledge Press, and they were like, hey, we understand you're the world's expert, or you're an expert on atheism. So you want to write the Atheism, The Basics? And I said, atheism, I've written like 2 articles about that. And the editor went, wait, what's the difference? So in atheism and secularism, are completely different. So one reason for getting into this is to disarticulate these two very, very important isms, which are very different isms, which have very different genealogies and very, very different histories. So that was one of my major motivations. But of course, there were others, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a moment.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Well, that's one good reason to write the book. Now, this is, in the circles I hang out in, people tend to be a little bit worried and afraid of the secularists. So, as an Anglican priest, as a minister of religion, should I be worried about all these secularists or all the secularism that is out to get me?
Some secularisms are truly frightful to me and you and Anglicans and Muslims and Jews, but some secularisms I do believe are more or less benign and really are trying to guarantee the maximal amount of religious freedom and freedom from religion for as many citizens as possible. That is a very complex governing task, and that's what the best secularisms try to do. So should you be afraid? Depends on the secularism. I'd be very afraid of what I call Soviet atheist. I'd be very afraid of what I call Soviet atheist secularism. I'd be given the Bulgakov treatment. I would just disappear in the middle of the night, as Stalin did to the famous writer. So yes, there are some secularisms we should fear, but there are many secularisms that we should not only respect, we should try to install and make part of our liberal democracies.
Yeah. And one interesting thing I like about the book, Jacques, is you rooted secularism in the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis 1, 26 to 28, about being in the image of God. Could you unpack that for a moment? Because that will surprise a lot of people.
Sure. So I argue there are 10 principles that one finds in every discussion about secularism. I call them the 10 basic principles. And then the principles are arranged into a framework. One of the core principles is the idea of the equality of all human beings in the eyes of the state. So looking at Genesis 1:27 to 1:28, man and woman in the image of God, in the image of God, he created them. The Hebrew's a little bit dicey there. As you know, to me, that's one of the great biblical texts, that and the book of Ruth. I love the book of Ruth, right? Those are some of my favorite biblical texts. That text was later read by some Christian leaders to indicate that in the eyes of the state, all human beings under the jurisdiction of the state had a fundamental God-given dignity. And if they had that fundamental God-given dignity, there were limitations on what the state could subject them to. So I feel, even though that verse itself doesn't say that, the verse was exegeted or interpreted across Christian time and space to open up a possibility for usually Enlightenment philosophers such as John Locke, for example, to read it in that particular way.
Okay, that's good. So it is kind of rooted in a particular historical and democratic tradition that believes earnestly in the equality of all human beings, and then wants to apply that to the way that different human beings may choose to be religious or not. So it's to protect the dignity and the rights of the individual citizens. The problem is we have citizens with different religious views, and we've got to come a settlement where they can live together peacefully without doing things like 30 years of war between Protestants and Catholics, Sunni, Shia, or
That's
between
one problem. May I mention another? Another problem is racism. So when you have Christian polities that look at persons who are not white Christians as not human and therefore not amenable to receiving the largesse of the state, which sees them as having a fundamental God-given dignity, well, clearly that's a problem. So equality is this grand, vaunted principle that we're still struggling, groaning together, all of us, to bring properly into play. Secularism is a project in the works. It's not complete, and it's never really hit its stride. We're still trying to make the equality principle a real bona fide principle of a functioning polity.
Yeah, and that's where I would add that, tell me what you think of this, that secularism is a means to an end. It's not an end of itself. We want secularism because we want a certain degree of equality. Okay, we don't want to privilege some voices needlessly, nor suppress others. And that's an important thing. It's not like secularism is an end of itself. It's an end towards a particular value, which is usually equality between citizens, irrespective of religion or lack thereof or ethnicity.
That's one of them. And there's also peace.
Yeah.
Because as I argue in my reconstruction of John Locke's thinking in the 17th century, he casts what Hegel would call a melancholy glance back at history. And he's looking at the 30 Years' War, and he's probably thinking of the St. Bartholomew's massacre of the previous century, and all of this religious intolerance. And he has this great insight, Professor Bird, and the insight is, if there's no peace, no one gets to God. If everyone is disemboweling everyone for religious reasons and often for political reasons, you can't pray, you can't worship the divine, you can't live an ethical Christ-like life, you can do nothing unless there is peace. Now, Locke referred to it as order, which has a much more sinister tincture to it. There must be order. And when we talk about secularism's gone wild and run amok, we'll talk about the order problem.
No, well, that's always the problem is how much order do you need in secularism? Because I tend to think of secularism as a way of creating space for people of all faiths and none to define religious freedom, but also to define the limit of religious freedom. And the question is, how much regulation of religion do you need for that to happen? Right. And this is where we have to come down to. There are different ways of doing that. And one great thing about your book is you give an excellent survey, an excellent taxonomy of the different ways of being secular. So could you tell us briefly what you think is the worst way and which is the best way?
So I refer to those as the frameworks of secularism. So each framework takes those 10 principles and balances them, mutes them, erases them, augments them differently. So it's like different algorithms or different ways of placing the principles on the scale. Like equality becomes very important in some secularisms and order does not. Toleration becomes very important in some say. Then you get mixtures of equality and toleration and free exercise of religion. And this creates a different type of secular framework. So let's talk about the frameworks. The worst framework by far, but unfortunately, it's probably the most numerous in terms of countries that it has affected, would be what I call Soviet atheist secularism, which I do see as aberrational, but nevertheless, it has the DNA of the secular genome. In Soviet atheist secularism, a few problems occur. The first is the state arrogates to itself complete and total power, something on the level of what medieval popes assumed they possess, this doctrine of plenitudo potestatis, which is what got secularism born in the first place. We can get into that in a moment. The idea that the Pope had a certain absolute power or veto power over everything. So the Soviet state, as we know, turns out to be this massive thing, this massive structure, this Death Star, which regulates every aspect of a citizen's life in the name of the secular principle of order. So why must Orthodox churches be razed to the ground? Because they're a threat to the integrity of the state and foreign agents are infiltrating. In the People's Republic of China, why must missionaries be cast out of the country? Because they are treasonous and they're going to foment rebellion. So we see that in the worst types of secularisms, the idea of order becomes fetishized and reified and aggrandized to the point that it simply becomes an excuse for a fully tyrannical authoritarian state. So bad secularisms follow the Soviet model, but there are a lot. I mean, we were talking about them today in my global secularisms class. This is everywhere from Africa. We could talk about Ethiopia, for example, with the Derg in 1974, to Central America, and of course to Asia, where we have one living, breathing, Eastern Europe, of course, also, but we now have one living, breathing descendant of Soviet atheist secularism, and that is in the People's Republic of China. And I don't think any of us feel that is an exemplary way of granting religious freedom or freedom from religion to over 1 billion human beings.
Yeah, that's a good way. And do you have a best option? I'm expecting it to be America. America is always the best.
No. Secularism, the separation of secularism in the United States is on life support. I don't actually think we have secularism anymore in this country, and we can get into that. Separationism as a judicial doctrine has been dead for at least 3 decades. I know this is very unpopular, Professor. I know, but just bear with me. I like the French system because I've seen it work and not work. And what doesn't work, I feel, or at least I felt, can be fixed. The French system is born of a uniquely French history and a uniquely French battle with the Catholic Church, which was bloody and extended across centuries and peaked first with the Revolution of 1789 and the Paris Commune of 1871. As Henri Peña-Ruiz, a very good scholar of laïcité, once said, French secularism is born in tears and blood. So I feel the French have a real understanding of where they want religion to be and where they don't want religion to be. And it's predicated on historical trauma and historical memory. That being said, they make lots of mistakes. They do things that I am not at all comfortable with. Their treatment of various religious groups, in particular, some types of Islam, I feel are just inexplicable and certainly not to be emulated by other countries. However, here's the big however, in my book, I do speak about transnational movements. And transnational movements are uniquely destabilizing to all secularism. What are transnational religious movements? So this would be, let's call it global Islam. I'm more referring to Wahhabism, for example, right? What do you do with transnational actors with massive budgets and very skilled people and engineers and doctors and PR people and funders and a military wing, you might say, who destabilize sovereign nation states? And this isn't only an Islam thing. We find that many of the hotspots in Africa and Latin America are stoked by evangelical groups funded and operating out of the United States. So many of the bills you might see in Uganda, the infamous Kill the Gays bill of 2013, 2014, I believe. Who is funding that? Who is writing the legislation? Who is doing the legal legwork? These were evangelical groups in the United States. So when we speak about transnational actors, we have to recall that religion goes across boundaries. That's beautiful. But one sovereign nation state, such as France, which of course is a member of the EU, always has to contend not just with its small Muslim minority, that's true, right? So you've got Goliath in the form of France and the small minority in the form of the Muslim population of France, but you've also got those transnational actors, which levels the playing field to a point where we see some of the just awful, depressing incidents that have occurred in France over the last decade. So I think it's a very complicated critique we have to make of French laïcité. There are things that are wrong there, but we have to understand what it's up against.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a Catholic rather than a Protestant origin for a start, so that's going to be different. And it's been more with the struggle between state and Pope, which is something, I mean, the English had their own problems with different types of Protestantism, plus a lingering Catholicism on the margins, then add a little bit of Northern Ireland and Ireland, and, you know, that type of thing. It's interesting, Australia was founded to be a secular country, in a government sense, because we didn't want that. We knew the problem with the British system, so we kind of edged closer to the American system. If you look at our constitution,
could you compare that though to what the British did in India? So in India, they really adopted a kind of pseudo secularism, not a secularism the British wanted at home. They didn't want that in London, right? It was an Anglican established country, but in their colonial holdings, and I guess Australia can be considered, I don't know, you help me, a colonial holding.
Yeah, they we get called the colonials.
So what was good for them was not good for us. I think that's how the British from the Home Office might have looked at it, right? It's good for them, those others, right? But for us, we don't need secularism. They need secularism. They need secular policies. And of course, we can all see what the flaw is with that.
Indeed. But I was going to say, if I had some reservations about laïcité, I would say the primary motivation was anti-Catholic, sort of pro-Bourbonism, for those who wanted to bring back the Bourbon monarchy and even though it was probably too late, the fear that the Catholics wanted to bring back a monarchy. Also, during laïcité, you get, or the early parts of it, you get the Dreyfus affair, and you still have a lot of anti-Semitism all the way leading up to Vichy France. And even Emmanuel Macron, even his in the face of these sort of, you know, global Islam, he kind of wants to francify Islam. You know, Islamic ministers will have to be accredited by the state. attend accredited seminaries, which is kind of similar to China, where they have their own state seminaries. They have an official state church that's regulated by them. Now, it's not exactly the same, but I cannot imagine, a US president announcing that they're about to nationalize Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, or they're going to nationalize Fuller Seminary, or requiring all Baptists will now have to do their MDiv at Harvard Divinity School. That was, if it was, so that's what I would see is that I think the ordering side is now seem to be what they're doing against.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's just going to make it worse. I wonder if that is, the more you try to regulate people's religion, the more you get a visceral reaction. I wonder if there are got to be better ways of deflecting these global actors. And, we know we're largely talking about Saudi Arabia and their various religious actors and agents, and we get some of them active in Australia as well. So I'm very alert to the nature of the threat. But I wonder if the overregulation is going to backfire in a really bad way.
Yeah, again, right. So what's so interesting about secularism is it's this kind of sensitive balancing of competing interests and competing cross pressures. The system you're referring to, actually, to the best of my knowledge, goes back to Napoleon. It was Napoleon with the Concordat system that essentially made first Lutherans and then Calvinists and then Jews register with the state. And Napoleon wanted to know what's what and who's who and what are you doing. And I understand how, to an Anglo sensibility, this makes people very, very, very uncomfortable. To a Gallic sensibility, if you don't do it, you won't have a state. Let's leave aside the moral standing of who the leader might be. Religion, this is a very interesting question for Africa, by the way, right? Religion has shown itself again and again to be a force multiplier in terms of organizing human beings, often towards very, very good ends. We could cite the civil rights movement in the United States. We could cite South Africa with
Desmond Tutu.
Archbishop Tutu, right? So there are clear examples where religion, right, can do things that can do things to corrupt states that no other form of human organization can. And we don't want to lose that power, right? As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, the church is neither the master nor the servant of the state. I've always found that to be very, very profound. And I wish more religious folks, especially Christians in my country, would think of it that way. It doesn't serve the state, right? But it's not the master of the state either. And we're right back to this binary idea that there are kind of two powers in every polity, and each one has its sovereign domain. Back to the point I was making, how do you assure, and as I think about my debates across my life with a lot of religious folks who are always telling me in the 70s, Jacques, it's over, religion is chill, it's calmed down, it's not going to do stupid shit anymore, enough, right? They were wrong. I'm not gloating, right? But the problem remains, how do you grant religious people the absolute maximum of free exercise, religious freedom, toleration, while assuring that your nation state built on a constitution and assumedly built on the will of the people continues to exist? And that existential dilemma, I feel, is confronting the United States right now. If we continue in the direction that we are currently going, we're not going to have a liberal democracy for much longer. And many of us in my domain are blaming certain religion, not religion. That's not religion's fault. Certain religious actors are creating a situation in which we feel our liberal democracy is deeply, deeply imperiled.
That's a good way. I can understand. I did an interview with a Canadian theologian, John Stackhouse. He said one of the ways that American evangelicalism is different to global evangelicalism is American evangelicals think they should be in charge, and they can't seem to grasp the fact that they might not be, or conceive of a world where they are not the dominant demographic or the dominant influence in the political spectrum.
So the will to power, right? We talked about Nietzsche earlier. The will to power that characterizes some religious groups, Some. Do I see this in United Churches of Christ? No. Do I see this in Reformed Jews? No. Do I see this in America's Muslim minority groups? No, I don't see it, right? Unfortunately, among certain types of, let's say it, white Christian, now nationalist formations, we see this will to power. And the only thing that can stand up to that, by the way, is the state. So now you have these two behemoths, right, looking at one another, right? Yeah. The state with all its massive arsenal of power, we can read Foucault and all its machinations and all its sinister desire to control, and states do that without a doubt. And religion, with its ability to stoke the passions and organize people and make people do things that they would do for no other type of institution they would do for their religious beliefs. So yeah, we might be able to speak of a post-secular. It always cracks me up when people speak of the post-secular. Why? Because, all right, let's say you got rid of secularism. Let's say you buried it, ground its bones into dust, and sprinkled the ashes across the Atlantic. The problem would still remain. How is a state supposed to engage with its religious and non-religious citizens? That is secularism in a nutshell. That's what secularism is trying to figure out.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of putting it. Well, to sort of segue on that, what do you wish that the average American or Australian evangelical knew about secularism? If you could say, look, the one thing about secularism I want you to know is X. What's the X?
Your ancestors probably wish they had more secularism, especially in the United States. If your ancestors were Baptists, Baptists were the great defenders of secular verities up until around 1970. And there's still groups like the Joint Baptist Committee in the United States. There's still these old groups that have the old insight. Remember what sorry about this, sir, the Anglicans. Remember what the Anglicans did to us, right? Remember what life was like in England when they tortured us and persecuted us and put us in prisons, right, for our beliefs. So I would love those that have a Baptist genetic connection to remember what it was like when a larger religious group suppress their religious freedom. That's really what I'd like to do.
I agree. I have many arguments with my Baptist students, and I'm always threatening to go into their creche and secretly baptize their children while they're worshiping. That's my revenge. Okay, well, let's change tack. What's something you wish the average atheist knew about it? And I'll be honest with you. I want you to picture a 25-year-old vegan with a neck tattoo who's doing an internship at the New York Times, and meeting a guy for a date on a website, and she finds out she's Southern Baptist, and she kind of responds as if someone has just put a pile of dog poo in her entree. I mean, that type of a person.
As long as the guy is sleeved, right? All right, that's good. He's got the tattoo around it. I like it. I think American atheists in particular, I really want them to know a couple of things. First is maybe the new atheists of the early aughts shouldn't be worshipped and venerated to the degree that they actually are, because that type of white guy anger towards everything never finishes well. And we're looking at where new atheism bottomed out. And it bottomed out in some really bad places. Islamophobia, misogyny, the January 6th insurrection. I don't know where these cats all ended up. But if you were on the receiving end of that, as I and many scholars were, as you know, I'm Jewish, but I'm an atheist, right? So I was saying I'm Jewish. And you would receive this vitriol for being critical of the new era. You're like, these guys are angry. These are very angry men, right? So that type of anger is never helpful. Secondly, look at religion as a spectrum, my atheist friends. And I think many atheists do this. What I'm trying to say is I think the new atheists really gave atheism a sort of gloss and a look, which has not really been my experience with atheists. Atheists are very, very thoughtful people. They can be very spiritual people, believe it or not. When they are aggressed upon, when they feel their civil rights are being violated, understandably, they can get a little bit truculent. But I would urge atheists to take pleasure in all religion has created, to walk through the Louvre, for example, and think about all Western painting up until the 18th century. When you're listening to most classical music up until the same period, you're listening to people that are writing to and for and about and in contemplation with the divine. So there's a treasury of knowledge and art and wisdom and beauty in religion that I would hope atheists would scrutinize, and they do peruse that. So I want people not to have this image of atheists as this kind of fire-breathing hater, culture despiser of religion. The last thing, I think atheists need to know more about secularism. They always seem to think secularism is separation of church and state. And I go to great pains in the book to point out separation of church and state is one type of secularism. It's one framework. There are forms of secularism that are not predicated on separation of church and state, like the French model, where the state controls the church. Full stop. That's not separation. The state is telling the churches and the mosques that you're going to do this and you're going to close on this day and you're not going to do that. That's not separation. So separationism needs to be disarticulated from secularism.
Okay, well, that's a very good way of putting it. Finally, just me remind viewers that the book is Secularism, the Basics. You can get it at Amazon or all good booksellers. Well, Jacques, it's been a pleasure talking to you. This has been a very good, illuminating conversation, and I know a great many people will benefit from it as well.
Thank you, Professor. I love speaking to scholars. It's always the best. Thank you.
Okay, well, take care.
All right, take care. You as well. Bye.